Hello and welcome to FunBikes TV. Today we're going to be building an 800 watt Toxic mini quad. When you receive your mini quad, it'll be in a box like this. To start off with, we will need to cut the banding on top of the box to allow us access to the vehicle. Inside the box you will find there is a steel cage holding the quad. You will also find that there is a seat and a contents box. You will now need to remove the cardboard box from the outside of the cage to allow you access to the vehicle. You will find the handlebars are cable tied to the cage, so cut the cable ties, and then undo the 4 5mm Allen key bolts that hold the cage together to allow you to remove the vehicle. You will find at the front and the rear of the vehicle there are wires holding the quad into the cage. Cut these to allow you to lift the quad out of the bottom half of the cage. Inside your contents box you will find the following parts: your front number board, your handlebar pad, a bag of various nuts, bolts and fixings, your maintenance toolkit, your battery charger, your front bull bar, your manual, and an important sheet on battery maintenance. We are now ready to start assembling our Toxic mini quad. To start off with, we're going to attach the lower shock bolts into the swing arm. Lower the swing arm down and then align the front shock with the mounting holes. Using the short bolts that are in your nuts and bolts pack, push it through the swing arm and shock and attach the nut on the back of it. You'll need a 10 and 13 spanner to tighten these. When you tighten them, make sure that they are fully tight and there is no side to side play in the shock at the bottom. Once you're happy it is fully tight, apply stud lock to the end of the threads. Repeat the process on the opposite side. Once you have fully tightened both sides and applied stud lock, we're then ready to move on to attaching the stub axles and track rod ends. You'll see that the stub axle bolts are already through the stub axles. Remove the nut off the end and then align the stub axle with the yoke with the caliper situated at the front. Tighten these, you need an 8th Allen key and a 17 spanner. When you tighten the stub axle up, make sure you do not over tighten so you crush the bearings and the steering still turns freely for your child, but also make sure there is no side to side play in the stub axle. Once you are happy with this, apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads. We are now ready to attach the track rod end. Remove the bolt and nut from the rose joint. You will need a 6 Allen key and a 13 spanner or socket to undo this. You will find when you remove the nut and bolt from the rose joint there is also a spring washer on there. The correct order to attach this is put the bolt through the rose joint, followed by the spring washer, then place that through the stub on the top of it with the nut on the bottom. Fully tighten the bolt through the rose joint. Once it is fully tight, it is still normal to be able to move the rose joint forwards and backwards like so. Once you are happy it is tight, apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads. Repeat the process on the opposite side of the quad.
We're now ready to attach the number board to the front of the quad. Remove the bolt in the centre of the steering column using a 10 spanner or socket. Apply a small amount of stud lock to the end of the threads. Locate your number board in the correct position and then replace the bolt through the number board into the steering column. Before you fully tighten it, make sure that your number board is aligned correctly and square with an equal gap on each side of it between the bolt holes at the front. And then fully tighten your number board. We are now ready to fit our handlebars to our Toxic mini quad. In your various nuts and bolts bag you will find the 4 longer bolts needed to do this, along with the 4 handlebar clamps. You will find that 2 of them have notches out of them and 2 of them are totally smooth. The smooth ones are located on the bottom of the handlebars, the ones with the notches go on the top of them. Take your handlebars, place them over the top of your front number board and route the cables behind the front number board. Take one of your handlebar clamps to the bottom, the smooth one, and align it into the correct position. Take your top clamp and put it on top. You will find there are notches in your handlebars to help you position the bars centrally in the correct position. Then loosely fit the front bolt to the handlebars and take the rear bolt and apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads. Align it and again loosely fit this bolt using a 10 spanner or socket. Tighten it to the point that everything stays in situ, but allow yourself movement to be able to centre the bars on the notches in them. Remove the front bolt now and apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads before reattaching. At this point, do not fully tighten these bolts. Repeat the process on the opposite side using the smooth clamp at the bottom and the clamp with the notch out at the top. This time you can directly apply stud lock to the end of the first bolt threads and again loosely flipped. Now that you have loosely fitted all 4 bolts through the clamps holding the bars in position, you can make sure that your bars are set at the correct angle. The centre bar on the handlebars needs to be an equal distance between the front and rear bolts on the quad. And the handlebars need to run at the same angle as the steering column. Once you are happy with this and that the bars are central on the notches on them, you can then start to fully tighten the handlebar clamps. When you do this, make sure that the gap at the front and the back of the clamps is equal on both sides. We are now ready to fit the front bull bar to our quad, which was in the contents box. To start off with, remove the 2 lower bolts attaching it to the chassis, and then the 2 bolts at the top with the nuts on them. Place a small quantity of stud lock onto the end of the threads of one of the bolts, and then align your bull bar, placing the bolt through loosely at this point. Apply a small quantity of stud lock to the second bolt. And attach this to the quad again at the bottom. We're now ready to align the top bolts into the frame, again applying a small quantity of stud lock to each bolt, placing the bolt in from the outside and then placing the nut on the inside. Once you have attached all 4 bolts and aligned the front bull bar, you can then fully tighten them using a 10 spanner or socket on the bottom bolts and a 10 and 13 spanners or sockets on the top bolts. We are now ready to attach the rear shock absorber onto the quad. Lift the rear swing arm up and align the shock with the mounting bracket. Using one of the shorter bolts from your nut and bolt pack, place it through the mounting bracket and the shock absorber, and then apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads before attaching the nut and fully tightening with a 10 and 13 spanners or sockets. We're now ready to attach our rear reflector to the quad. Remove the nut off the back of the reflector. Align the rear reflector and then reattach the nut onto the back of it. Making sure that you get the reflector square as you tighten it up using an 8mm spanner. Once you have it fully tight, apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads. We have now fully built our Toxic Mini Quad less the seat, which we're going to leave off while we do a full nut and bolt check of the vehicle to allow us access to some of the bolts. Using a 5mm Allen key, tighten your front brake caliper on the 2 bolts located just here. Then tighten the front upper shock absorber bolt using a 10 and 13 spanners or sockets. Applying a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads. Moving on to the inside track rod ends using a 6 Allen key and 13 spanner, make sure that it is tight and apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads. We're now going to tighten up the bottom of the steering column, making sure that we do not over tighten this. If we do, it will make the steering hard for the child to turn. Using a 17 socket or spanner. As you are tightening it, keep checking the steering still moves freely for your child. If you have over tightened it, back it off a fraction. Once you are happy, apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads. We're then ready to tighten the steering column mounting bracket at the bottom using a 5 Allen key and a 10 spanner. Make sure both bolts are tight. Once you are happy, apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads. We can now tighten the front swing arm bolt using a 12 and 14 spanner. Once this is fully tightened, apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads. Moving on to the opposite side brake caliper, again make sure the mounting bolts are tight using a 5 Allen key. Check your upper shock bolt using a 10 and 13 spanner or socket combination and applying a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads. Using a 6 Allen key and a 13 spanner, tighten the other inside track rod end bolt and apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads. We're now ready to level off our brake levers on the Toxic Mini Quad. Start off with using a 3 Allen key. Loosen off the throttle unit. There is a grub screw located underneath it. Then rotate the throttle unit around.
We can then use a 5 Allen key to loosen off the actual brake lever. The brake lever needs to be angled down to be in a comfortable position for the child to ride the bike. Once you are happy with the angle that the brake lever is at, retighten the brake lever and the throttle unit. We're now ready to level off the opposite side brake lever. Using a 2.5mm Allen key, loosen off the horn unit. Then using the 5 Allen key again, loosen off your brake lever. Looking across the handlebars, make sure it is level with the brake lever on the opposite side. Once you're happy with this, retighten the brake lever and the horn. We are now ready to tighten the 2 bolts that hold the steering column in on the steering boss at the top using a 10 and 13 spanner. Make sure both sides are fully tight. And apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads. We're now going to work our way around the quad using a 5 Allen key and a 10 spanner to tighten all of the plastic bolts. Make sure you do not over tighten the bolts as they are only into plastic and you can crack them. We're now going to tighten the rear swing arm using the 12 and 14 spanners or sockets. Once it is fully tight, apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads. We're now going to tighten the lower rear shock bolt using a 10 and 13 spanner and applying a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads once it is fully tight. We're now going to check the 4 motor bolts are tight using a 10 spanner on the top and a 13 spanner or socket on the bottom. Once we're happy that all 4 of them are tight, apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads. We're now going to remove the chain guard off the quad to check the rear sprocket bolts and chain tension. Using a Phillips screwdriver, undo the screws located at the rear of the chain guard.
and then use a 4 Allen key to undo the 2 mounting bolts on the top of the chain guard. This will allow us to split the chain guard in half. As you can see, the chain is loose on this quad, so it will need adjusting and tightening before use. To start off with, we're going to tighten off the sprocket bolts using 2 10 spanners. Once we're happy they are tight, we can apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads. We're now ready to adjust the chain tension on the quad. Using an 8 spanner or socket, loosen off the upper and lower bearing carrier bolts on both sides. Do not fully remove the bolts, only loosen them. Use an Allen key, locate it into the bearing carrier where one of the holes is. There are 2 on each side. As you can see, the bearing carriers are an oblong shape, so as you rotate them around, it moves the rear axle closer or further away from the motor, allowing you to tighten or loosen the chain. It is critical that you adjust both sides equally and the holes on each of them when you are finished are in the same position. As you are going, keep checking your chain tension on the vehicle. Keep checking your holes on both sides are in equal positions. If they're at different positions, this will cause the quad to track to the left or the right, as the axle will not be square in the vehicle. It will also put excessive wear on your chain and sprocket. Small adjustment makes a big difference to the chain tension. Once you're happy with the chain tension, tighten the bearing carriers on each side, making sure the gap is equal at the top and bottom of the bearing carriers when you tighten them. Keep checking your chain tension as you are going along. Once you have tightened your bearing carriers again, do one final check on your chain tension and then replace the chain guard. Replacing the front Allen key bolts first. And then the 3 Phillips screws at the rear. We're now ready to tighten the rear wheels. Using a 22 socket, hold the rear brake on and make sure the rear wheel nuts are tight. Once they are fully tight, apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads. We're now going to check the front wheels are tight. Make sure there's no side to side play in the front wheels, but they still spin over freely. If you over tighten them, it will cause the quad to pull to the left or the right, and it can also crush or damage the front bearings in the wheel. Once you are happy with the tightness of the front wheel nut, apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads.
Repeating the process for the front wheel on the opposite side. We are now ready to set the front brakes on our quad. When we are setting the brakes, we need to make sure that the brake pads are as close to the disc as possible without touching it. To set the front brakes, start off with using an 8th spanner and the Allen key, loosen off the centre bolt on the brake caliper. This moves the inside pad away from the brake disc to allow us to set the far side. Using the top and bottom adjusters, they will move the far side of the caliper closer or further away from the disc. Set this side as close as possible without touching. You can normally adjust these with your fingers, but if they are tight, you can use an Allen key to rotate them. Top bolt adjusts the top half of the caliper, the bottom bolt adjusts the bottom half of the caliper. Make sure that you set them equally so that the pads wear equally on your bike. Once you're happy with the outside pad, you can then move on to the interior pad. Using the Allen key to wind the pad back in as close as possible to the disc without touching it. Hold the nut with the 8mm spanner while you're doing this. As you are doing this, keep spinning the front wheel over and pressing the brake to make sure that the brake is biting correctly. Once you are happy with the front brake on this side, hold the centre bolt with the Allen key and retighten the nut, and then repeat the process on the opposite side.
Once you're happy with the second side brake, you will then need to check the brakes to make sure that they pull equally. Spin both wheels over and then apply the front brake, making sure that both brakes stop at the same point. Repeat this process several times to clarify that they are definitely stopping at the same point on there. Checking that there is equal pull on the brake calipers so that the quad doesn't pull to the left or the right when the brake is applied. We are now ready to set the tracking on the vehicle. To do this, we will need to loosen off the track rod. Using a 13 spanner, loosen off the nut on the track rods on the inside and the outside. One side will be a left-hand thread and one side will be a right-hand thread. Once you've loosened off the track rod, you can then set the tracking on the vehicle. By rotating the track rod, you can adjust the tracking so it either toes out or toes in. We need to set the tracking so that it is neutral. To do this, make sure that the steering on your quad is straight. Stand behind the vehicle and look down the edge of the back tyre and adjust the track rod so the front wheel is at the same alignment as the rear wheel.
A small adjustment on the track rod makes a big difference to the wheel's angle. Once you are happy, hold the track rod and wind the nuts back against the rose joints and then lock them off again tight. Repeat the process on the opposite side. We're now ready to fit the seat to our Toxic mini quad, sliding the front of the seat underneath the metal bracket. Push it in firmly at the front, then reach underneath the back of the quad to where the lever is on the seat and pull it backwards. And then push the seat down firmly and make sure that the bracket is locked into position. We're now ready to fit the handlebar pad to our quad. Remove the cover by undoing the Velcro and then using some scissors carefully cut down the centre of the pad. And place it over the centre of the handlebars. Reattach your cover over the bar pad. We're now going to fit our fuse to the vehicle, which we will need to do before we charge the quad, otherwise it will not charge correctly. The fuse will have come in your nuts and bolts bag. Place it into the holder. When you push it into the holder, it will spark. If it doesn't spark, the fuse has not been inserted correctly. Push it in firmly and then place the cover over the fuse to make sure that no moisture gets into there. We're now ready to charge our quad for the first time. Remove the charger from the box. When you do use the charger, make sure that you unravel the cables, otherwise it could cause the charger to overheat and burn out. The charge point on the quad is located underneath the front right mudguard. Remove the back cap and align the charger with the pinholes. There is a notch in it and a notch in the charger to make sure it aligns correctly. Once you have done this, plug your charger into the mains and turn the charger on. At first the light will turn to green and after a few seconds it will turn to red. This means the quad is charging. Regardless whether the light turns to green or not, leave the quad on charge for 12 hours for its first initial charge. This will boost your battery life. And that's how you build your new vehicle. I hope you found this guide useful. Now let the fun begin.